Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and today on Daddy Rolled a One, I'm going to be talking about the science fiction influences in the game of Dungeons and Dragons that actually have been there since the very beginning. I know a lot of times people these days, especially in kind of the post-Tolkien, world of fiction, will make a definite distinction between fantasy fiction and science fiction. And it makes sense because we tend to think of fantasy now, especially now, in kind of that Tolkien realm. So there are certain things that make sense in a Tolkien world that don't make sense in science fiction, and vice versa. And so a lot of times, again, people will make a definite dividing line between those two styles of fiction. However, pre-Tolkien, and it, it's not necessary that Tolkien is the one specific time when this made a difference, but there does seem to be a sort of a post-Tolkien view of fantasy fiction and a pre-Tolkien view. But pre-Tolkien, a lot of these terms that we use between fantasy and science fiction, they were much more muddied. And in the old days, when you went to a bookstore or a library to look for fiction of this type, they were all just put together on the shelf next to each other. Now, if you go to a bookstore, if you still have one near you, you'll see that they tend to separate science fiction books from fantasy, but that wasn't always the case. So I just want to talk about that a little bit because, again, I think, like, especially as you get into the later editions of D&D, so and not even just Wizards of the Coast. I mean, even TSR was starting to do this really with later parts of second edition, but then getting into third, fourth, and fifth, there's this definite view that science fiction doesn't have a place in Dungeons and Dragons. But again, it's been there since the very beginning. So let's jump in a little bit and talk about that. So if we look at Dungeons and Dragons here, again, you've seen this before on the channel. This is the original version of the game. This is called the White Box. It's a later printing. We've talked about that before. Okay, so if we go into this very specific book here, this is Men in Magic, so the first of the three books. And we're going to go into the what Gary mistakenly misspelled, forward. He left out the E. It's two different definitions of the word forward. But he talks about what this game specifically is. And as you get down here, trying to keep the book steady. I know a lot of times my hands shake, and I'm trying to not do that. So you see, he says right here, those who don't care for Burroughs' Martian adventures where John Carter is groping through black pits. So the first reference that he makes for the game of Dungeons and Dragons is to what we would now consider to be a group of science fiction stories. Okay, for Edgar Rice Burroughs' Martian adventure stories. So that is right in here, 1970. He's writing this in 1973, published in 74 for the first book of Dungeons and Dragons. So again, it's not definitive, but it's a start. Now let's get into the scope. So this is on the next page. This is page 5. And he says at the beginning here in the scope that the scope need not be restricted to the medieval. It can stretch from the prehistoric to the imagined future. So he's telling you right away in the first few pages of this book that you can use this game to play games in Edgar Rice Burroughs' Mars adventures or in an imagined future. Okay, and it continues on in the other books that are part of this. So really quick, let's look at the spells. So ESP is a spell. ESP is something that we associate with modern adventures. Now, you can have it in fantasy, of course, but it has its genesis really in more modern or speculative future fiction. And then there's also telekinesis in here, which again is something that typically we would associate with a more science fiction type setting as opposed to fantasy. So, Gandalf isn't casting telekinesis and ESP. All right, so then you've got the monsters. So not all the monsters in here. Obviously, there's a lot of typical fantasy things that you'd expect, the undead and skeletons and zombies and mummies and trolls and giants and things like that. But as time goes on, you start to get monsters in here that look a lot more alien. So we talked about the first appearance of the Mind Flayer, and they're going to appear first in the magazine format, and then later they do appear in publication. But the Mind Flayer, just the appearance alone, has this alien aesthetic to it that is not part of what you would associate with traditional fantasy. A lot of the monsters that are iconic to D&D, specifically the Rust monster, there's the Boulette, and then, or Boulet, I forget how to pronounce that, I apologize. And then the owlbear. Okay, so those three are iconic monsters, and there's a funny story that they're actually based on plastic play figures that were included in a baggie. I'll show a picture here. That I think, if memory serves, it was described as sort of like prehistoric creatures, or that kind of thing. But none of those look like prehistoric creatures. So Gary Gygax was using these in his games as miniature figures because they were running out of miniatures for monsters. And so what he did was he grabbed some of these toy miniatures and then came up with stats for them based on what they looked like. And so it turns out, he didn't know this at the time, but these monsters that he used, they were actually based on Japanese kaiju stories. So like, Godzilla type creatures from their stories. And one of them specifically was from Ultraman, which is, a science fiction type story. So again, you've got science fiction stuff baked into this. Now, he's not using the monsters in that type of setting, but it is just kind of funny. I thought you guys would appreciate knowing where some of those monsters were actually based on some of these original plastic figures. Okay, but you also have in here Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. This is book 3. So if we go to page 24, there's a note in here on other worlds. And so he says space could be passable because it is filled with breathable air. On the other hand, the stars could be tiny lights only a few hundred miles away. Some areas of land could be gates into other worlds, dimensions, times, or whatever. Mars is given in these rules, but some other fantastic world or setting could be equally possible. So again, he's going back to Mars, and he's telling you that you can use this game and don't be limited by a medieval fantasy aesthetic. You can do so much more with the game if you want to. So that's in there. So why do they keep talking about Mars? Well, it's interesting. Obviously, Edgar Rice Burroughs was an influence because he mentions that in Men and Magic. But shortly after TSR publishes Dungeons and Dragons 1974, they publish another game called Warriors of Mars. Now, this is technically a war game, okay? But remember, so was this. This says rules for fantastic medieval war games campaigns. So TSR wasn't distinguishing. This was not called a role-playing game. I know I've mentioned that so many times, but it's important to understand the time period of when these were happening, the melding of, or the distinction between what is a war game and what is a role-playing game are not, there's not there is no distinction, because to them it's all the same thing. You're using miniature figures, you're moving things around, and you're creating scenarios. And so they created this game Warriors of Mars that's a war game, but it has rules for individual melee combat in there. Okay, and then even in the rules, and it talks about like the different troop types you can have, they're given levels. So John Carter of Mars is given like level 13. You can see that here. So they're using levels similar to the way Dungeons and Dragons using now there's no character generation rules in here. There's nothing that we would associate with this being a role-playing game, but most likely what Gary and his group were doing were using rules from Dungeons and Dragons and from Chainmail to like run games of Mars similar to the way that they ran D&D. Now, they had to stop publishing this game right away because they didn't have the rights to use it. They just put it out there. And so they were asked to stop publishing that because they did not have, again, the rights to do the Mars stuff. But, that's out there from the beginning. So from the very, very start, they're interested in playing games in a Martian type setting. All right. So you've got Blackmoor, which introduces the Beholder and things like that. So this one doesn't really have the supplement. Supplement 1 doesn't have too much science fiction elements to it. However, let's get into Blackmoor. Okay, so this is Dave Arneson's campaign setting booklet. And what you see in here at the in the section on the Temple of the Frog. So Temple of the Frog is technically the first published adventure for Dungeons and Dragons that appears, in it from TSR, and it appears in this book. Okay, and then you see here he talks about the high priest of the Temple of the Frog. Okay, and he says that he's an intelligent humanoid from another world or dimension, and that he discovered a dimensional nexus point that allowed him to come to, where Blackmoor is now. And then if you go down here, he talks about how he has a suit of battle armor, a mobile medical kit, and a communications module. And then he describes down here what all those things are, like what the battle armor is and what it does. So again, super science fiction. Dave Arneson was very famous for incorporating a lot of science, what we would now call science fiction elements, into his Blackmoor games for his group that he ran. And so that, and all of that made it into Blackmoor in Dungeons and Dragons, and it's going to come out even more in the future. So just really quick, let's just look at this book. This is, you've seen this before on the channel if you watched before. This is the first fantasy campaign, and by Dave Arneson. This is his Blackmoor campaign, just with the name Blackmoor filed off for legal reasons. This is published by Judges Guild, but this is basically all the stuff. What the story I've heard is that this book got edited way down because for reasons. Okay, I'm not going to get into it too much, but basically Tim Kask is the editor on this. And what I've heard, what I've read, I've heard other people say is that Tim had to edit out a lot of the stuff that Dave tried to fit in here, partially just because, maybe it wasn't complete, or it was just notes. It wasn't, ready for publication. And so he cut a lot of stuff out. And so Dave basically put all of that stuff back in, and then more, and then publishes this. So this is like his guide to the Blackmoor campaign. It's just funny. On the outside, it says first fantasy campaign for legal reasons. But then right here on the inside, it says, the Blackmoor campaign. It talks. So, it's obvious that that's what this is. And here at the back, he talks about the original Blackmoor magic system. I talked about this a little bit in my video on the history of magic and D&D. But you see all these magical items. These aren't magic items. These are what we would call science fiction, equipment. Illusion projectors, skimmers, borers, screeners, tricorders, medical units, robots. So again, lots of science fiction elements in Blackmoor. And then that comes to its forefront when a series of modules are published in 1986 by TSR. This was the DA series of modules, DA for Dave Arneson. And there were 4 of them. Now, he wrote the first 3. The 4th one, I believe, was not written by him. But in this series of modules, it talks about a crashed spaceship and that how Blackmoor was essentially a technologically advanced society that ended up kind of destroying itself. And so the remnants of that technology still exists in the world. So what happened was Blackmoor was kind of inserted into the game of Dungeons and Dragons and ended up being both part of Greyhawk. So if you watch my video on the World of Greyhawk campaign setting, we talk about how Blackmoor exists in that world as a separate nation. It also exists in what was called the known world at the time, for the basic line, or what we now call the basic line of D&D. It was later known as Mystara. And Blackmoor is part of that world as well. And it has a much heavier influence in that world as far as like the history of these technological items that existed, kind of like influencing the world as a whole. So that's a whole other thing. But these modules are really fun. They're very, very different, but you can see the science fiction elements just from the cover art. Okay. So then you get into Dungeons and Dragons Eldritch Wizardry Supplement 3. This is 1976. And in here, they introduce a concept called psionics, okay, or mind powers. And it specifically says that it is one of the favorite topics of science fiction and fantasy writers. So again, they're not separating those two and saying that it's one or the other. It's saying this is both, and you can have psionics in your game if you want to. Now, I know a lot of people don't have it, and they specifically don't like it because they feel it is too science fiction-like. But it was part of the game at a time, and had its place even in advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, that Gary wrote later. All right, and then you've got just a quick aside. This is the fourth supplement. I haven't talked about this one too much, but this is Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. So this is by Rob Kuntz and Jim Ward, and unfortunately, there's really no index in this one or even a table of contents. It just starts out. But one of the things that he includes in here are the he's got stuff in here from the Michael Moorcock series of books about Elric of Melniboné. And so all that stuff ends up being in this particular book. And that's very science fiction. So if you've ever read those stories, those are I would call them science fiction. And so he's got all the different creatures and stuff in here, and gods or deities or heroes or whatever we want to call them. But they're all in here, and they definitely have a science fiction kind of feel to them. So that's put in this book. All right. So that's that. Now, 1975, backtracking just a tiny bit. But TSR publishes another game. So I've lost that part of my box. This box is just very old, as you can see. But this is published in 1975 by TSR. The mechanics are very much aligned to Dungeons & Dragons at the time, so early D&D. But if you see here, what it says that it's rules for fantasy adventures and campaigns on an alien planet. And if you go into, I have a whole video on this. You can, if you dig into my history, I'll put a link to it up here. But I talk about this game a lot more. But it talks about Tecumel is a planet of approximately the size of Earth, and has two. It was not always habitable for the races of man. However, when explorers from human space first discovered it, the planet was covered with a riotous growth of poisonous vegetation. So this whole game, this game world, is a planet that was settled by human space travelers, and now you're in the far future, and you're dealing with the fact that like the technology and stuff has kind of gone away and it's been replaced by other things. But this is technically, you could call it a science fiction game. I talk about that in my video because there's really no science fiction elements in here that we would associate with traditional science fiction, except for the setting itself and knowing the history that you're playing on an alien planet that was settled by people from Earth in the distant past, and you are now in the far future. Okay. All right, so just to continue with that Martian theme. So I just talked recently, I did a whole video about this particular magazine, but there's an article in this particular one. This is Best of Dragon Volume 1, number 1, and it's an article on the deserted cities of Mars. So this was one of the best articles that they decided to pull out of the first few issues of the Strategic Review, which was the predecessor magazine of Dragon, and put it in here. And it's all about how to create a Martian type city. So again, really doubled down on this stuff with Mars, but it's because Edgar Rice Burroughs was such an important influence in the early days of this game. The other thing that this particular magazine has, and you see fewer and fewer of these as time goes on. But in addition to articles in here for Dungeons and Dragons, you also see, you've got this article on the planes, and that's going to come up in a minute. But that's a very kind of science fiction thing to it. But these articles for the game Metamorphosis Alpha. So Metamorphosis Alpha is usually considered to be the first science fiction role-playing game, published in 1976 by TSR and written by James Ward. And so there are several different articles in here for that game. And so the whole front of this particular issue, in addition to that article on the planes by Gary Gygax, is specifically for the Metamorphosis Alpha game, not for Dungeons and Dragons, which I always thought was kind of interesting. So you've got that. Now, 1976 at Origins 2, a scenario was run. A competition scenario was run called Expedition to the Barrier Peaks. So 1976. And so in that particular adventure, the reason that TSR ran it at the convention was because they were using it to introduce players to the game of Metamorphosis Alpha that we just talked about, the science fiction game that they had come out with. So this adventure, it is a Dungeons and Dragons adventure, but and I have mentioned this before. I guess maybe it's too late, but if you ever want to play this and you want to be surprised, you're going to need to skip to the next chapter stop in the video. But basically, this adventure, the whole premise of it is that it takes place in a crashed spaceship. So a spaceship has crash landed in Greyhawk, and the characters are hired by one of the local barons to go investigate. They don't realize it's a spaceship. They have no idea because you have no context. And so the way that you're supposed to run this is you're supposed to run it straight and not actually tell the players what's going on. So you describe things like, oh, you enter a big metal cave, and it helps you, it gives you language in here to describe things so that the players might not actually clue in that they are in a spaceship. So, of course, the cover art gives it away a little bit because as you see these ray guns here. Also, I love this stuff. It's like, it's not a traditional type of gun. Okay, so this artwork is by Errol Otis, and he always does this kind of weird artwork. So this one is by Jim Rosloff, this piece right here. But these are the infamous Vegapygmies that are living on this spaceship. But you can see it's on a spaceship. And there's all this really fun art that they put in here to show you all the different artifacts and things that you can find. And then here's this whole art booklet that's in here that just has tons and tons of art. These are all like the different robots. Froghemoth. So that's another Errol Otis piece there. So some color art. So anyway, this is one of my favorite modules of all time. It's been ranked as usually one of the top 10, or if not top 5 modules of all time. But the whole point of this is a Dungeons and Dragons adventure. It says for the advanced D&D game, but with science fiction elements. So players can get science fiction type equipment in here. As you saw in here, there's medical packs and there's ray guns and all kinds of weapons and robots and computer stuff. And they can come across that. And then, so if you ran this as part of a campaign, you've just introduced, science fiction elements into your campaign. Written by Gary Gygax. This is going to come up in a minute with something else. But anyway, this is a great adventure that showing that, in the early days, at least, there was really not a lot of distinction between science fiction and fantasy. They were blending together. So this is just a quick peek at Metamorphosis Alpha. This is one of the things I really like having in my collection. It's kind of the predecessor game to a game called Gamma World, but it involves mutant creatures and mutant animals, as you see. Some fun artwork there. So this one is kind of hard to come across, which is just partly why I'm showing it to you right now, even though it's not technically part of our discussion of science fiction and D&D, other than this module or adventure was created to introduce players to this game, to try to get them to buy another game. Now, let's keep moving forward, and we're going to go to the release of the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. This is a later printing, but this is a first edition. Not meaning it's not for second edition D&D, it's for first edition advanced D&D. I know a lot of people before, when I showed this and said this was a first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, they're like, that's not first edition. It's not a first printing, but it is for first edition. But in any event, a couple sections in here. Now, I've talked about some of these before. You guys have seen this if you've watched my earlier videos on history, my history videos, or just actually I did a whole video about this particular book and why it's one of my favorite. It's one of my favorite books that I would want if I ever had to, get stuck on a desert island and wanted 4 D&D books. This would be one of the 4 I would want. So anyway, Gary writes an article in here called Mutants and Magic. And the idea here is it's showing how you can do a cross-genre game of Dungeons and Dragons or Advanced Dungeons and Dragons in this case, and Gamma World. So he says they've already covered Metamorphosis Alpha with Expedition to the Barrier Peaks. So, and Gamma World is the new game that's out. It's a post-apocalyptic game, but you could call it science fiction. And so he talks in here about how to run a game where characters from Gamma World end up in an advanced D&D world, or vice versa. And so how to do all of the different armor and weapons and saving throws, how to deal with all that stuff. So he talks about all of that in this particular article here. So this is part of the DM's guide. And he's telling you, like, yeah, go ahead and do that. Have fun and cross these things over so that you're keeping your players on your toes and you're giving them something to do. So it's not just the same old, Tolkien style elves and dwarves all the time. So I know that's what we're kind of used to now. But again, this is not that late after, this is only 5 years after D&D is published, and he's telling you, to keep going ahead to do that. Now, the other part that's in this book that we've talked about before is the very famous, what's called Appendix N. So this is the inspirational and educational reading. And if you look at this list here, so many of these are science fiction. I mean, again, you've got Edgar Rice Burroughs with his, the Pellucidar, which was kind of like Hollow Earth, but you've got Mars and Venus series on here. And you've got things by H.P. Lovecraft. That's I would call that science fiction. That's cosmic science fiction. His creatures aren't fantasy. They are cosmic beings. So definitely science fiction elements there. You've got your Michael Moorcock there. Again, we've talked about that a little bit before. So yeah, it's got some traditional, he's got Tolkien in here with like The Hobbit and things that we would associate now with being, so-called traditional fantasy. But there's just a lot of science fiction in there. Now, if you see at the very end here, Jack Vance, The Eyes of the Overworld and the Dying Earth. So again, if you watch my video on the history of magic and D&D, Jack Vance's name, but this is one of the inspirational texts for the creation of the game in D&D called The Dying Earth. That is straight up science fiction, folks. So the reason that D&D magic is called Vancian magic comes from this guy. Again, watch my video on that. I'll put a link here if you want to learn more about this. But these stories take place on Earth in the far, far, far future. So they are science fiction stories. And they were very inspirational to the creation of D&D. All right. So then last up, I'm going to talk about just kind of two more things really quickly here. So we've got Deities and Demigods. So this is published in 1980. Now, this is a second printing. And the reason that, just for people who are interested in this kind of stuff, the reason that I know that this is a second printing is because there is a, I thought the thank you was there. There's a thank you in here to the folks at, here it is. Special thanks is given to Chaosium for permission to use the material found in the Cthulhu mythos and the Melnibonéan mythos. Okay, so the long history of this, but I know I have talked about it before, but the first printing of this included Cthulhu and Melnibonéan mythos in them, and Chaosium had issues with that. We're not going to get into why, but so TSR put a thank you in their book in the second printing. Then the management at TSR decided they didn't want to give essentially what they thought of giving Chaosium, which is a competitor company, free advertising in their book. So in the third printing, they excised the Cthulhu and Melnibonéan mythos from the book. However, they forgot and they left the thank you in there. And then starting in the fourth printing, they removed the thank you. But one of the things they kept forgetting to do was on the back, it says 17 pantheons. So when they removed those two, it should say 15. So there's different versions of this book. And so you can always tell kind of which printing you have based on, does it include the thank you or not? So there's only two printings that include it, which is the second and third. And then does it say that it has 17 or 15? So once you get to the one that says 15, I think by that point, they have removed the thank you. They fixed everything, but there's just some quirky printings with this. But my point of bringing this out is that, again, it's got these Cthulhu mythos in here. And again, these are cosmic horror creatures. I wouldn't call them standard fantasy. So they very wisely got Errol Otis, who did the cover art for this book. And if you see the back here, that's very Cthulhu-like. But he's very known for doing kind of like weird art, and so he's the perfect person to do this. But so I show you this section because again, it's very hard to come by now because these books kind of were out of print pretty quickly before they replaced, basically just took these sections out of the book. So again, kind of science fiction-y, what I would call here. That's a great piece of art there for Yog Sothoth. And then you've got some more information here. And then he also includes, and I talked about this again, Melnibonéan. And again, these stories are very science fiction-y in nature. So this is, again, one of the key sources for the law and neutrality and chaos alignment system in D&D. So I have a whole video on the alignment system in D&D, so you can learn more about these books and that by checking out this video here. I'll put a link. All right, so you've got that, some science fiction elements in here. And then, of course, you get to the planar stuff. So an article in Dragon Magazine number 67 in 1982. So this is less than 10 years after D&D's been published. You have this article on the Astral Plane. And in here, Roger Moore talks about how you can see that, the Astral Plane can be used for people to like travel between areas in their home plane. They use the astral plane kind of like for astral travel, right? Or space travel. That's essentially what astral is going to mean in this particular case. So you have this way of moving between worlds. Okay. And he talks about that in this setup. And then there's this whole article. And then there's a whole adventure in here, Fetafensor, which takes place on the astral plane. So very early on, they're showing you that, you're not limited, again, to these medieval campaigns. So you can be, and they can be a lot of fun. And they actually do suggest kind of master that first before you start some of this other stuff. But they're trying to show you that use your imagination and don't be limited into this kind of box of what you think fantasy really means. Just be open to it. Okay. If you want, again, you don't have to, but I think that there's a lot of evidence to support that the original creators of the game played that way and that they liked all these different elements. And I haven't even covered everything. There's just so much out there to show you. I'm just showing you bits and pieces, mostly from my own personal collection, because I think that's more fun than like just showing you screenshots of stuff that you could, look up yourself. Okay. So, but you have this now. One other quick fun thing about this article, not related to science fiction, but it is a time capsule, is in the introduction to the article in the Astral Plane, Gary is writing and saying that the author of the article is saying that it's unofficial because it's not by Gary. Let's read between the lines. That's what he means. But the other thing that he says is that it doesn't include some information on the two new subclasses, and then he labels them as the Mystic and the Savant. And he says, I'm still working on them, but they have planar elements to these two new classes or subclasses that you'll see. And this was because at this point, Gary's working on a revision to D&D, or an expansion, I guess, to advanced D&D. And he has mentioned that these two classes or subclasses are things he's working on. We never see these two subclasses from Gary. So we only see the Cavalier, the Thief Acrobat, and the Barbarian. I've talked about those before. But this Mystic and Savant that he's mentioned, and he mentioned some others in another article, never see the light of day. And so a lot of people like to theorize, like, what would these classes have been like had he actually ever finished writing them? So that's just a little aside. But let's get back to the planar stuff. You have the release of this whole book of planar travel. Now, this was one of the very last books that was published in the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons line. This is 1987, I want to say. Yeah. And I was very lucky to get this book. This was the last book that I did not have. So if you watch my video on the history of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons hardback books, I go through all of them. And when I got to this one, I had to show screenshots and say, I didn't have this book. And some kind person on Reddit saw my video and contacted me and said, hey, I have an extra copy. It's got someone's name written in the front. That wasn't this guy's name. And, but it's extra. And if you want it, you seem like a cool guy. I'll mail it to you. So, this community can be really fun and just full of really nice people. And so I was so excited to get this so I could complete my collection of hardbacks. But this whole book, and again, I've got a whole video on it, and I've linked to it earlier, is all about planar travel and moving between planes. That is, it takes place within a fantasy, I guess, aesthetic, but it's a very science fiction idea of traveling between worlds. Okay. And then we're not even going to get into now because this video would just be even longer than it already is. But 1989, or maybe a little bit later, shortly after the release of second edition Dungeons and Dragons, you have the release of Spelljammer. So if you're a 5e player, you might know they just kind of released a recent book on Spelljammer. But that campaign goes back 30 years at this point. Um, and that is all about space travel in Dungeons and Dragons. So again, we could, that's just too much to cover in this particular video, but you can see that these elements are there. That really kind of was the last one, though. So you had Spelljammer, you had Dark Sun, which takes place on, a different world, and it has sort of a Dune slash post-apocalyptic, almost Mad Max, but without all the technology. But there's a very kind of post-apocalyptic aesthetic to the Dark Sun setting that's kind of science fiction-y, but nothing like Spelljammer, right? And then in 3.5 edition, you have Eberron, which has with Magitech and things like that, where you have like a fantasy science fiction mashup kind of thing. But for the most part, D&D and the company as a whole has sort of moved away from this idea of intermixing fantasy and science fiction until 5e, they put out the Spelljammer book. I think they were just kind of testing the waters to see like what people would think about that. But anyway, that is my going to be my look at a very short history, not super in depth, but just kind of talking about the idea that science fiction elements have been part of Dungeons and Dragons since the very, very beginning. And if you don't like them in your game, that's totally fine. But I've heard people say that like, that there shouldn't be science fiction in D&D. I think, that's just personal opinion. Either you like that or you don't. And, if you're trying to play a strict Tolkien style game, it wouldn't make sense. But for the original creators of the game, the fiction that they grew up with, we talked about that. They were inspired by both science fiction, what we would now call science fiction elements, and fantasy elements. And I think that there's an opportunity to include them in a game and give it a try, see what you like. But, let me know what you think. Do you like using science fiction in games? One of my longtime players, and I've played in campaigns that he's run, he refers to it as, the old, you put peanut butter on my chocolate. He hates it. He hates the idea of mixing fantasy and science fiction. He doesn't like stuff like Warhammer 40K for that specific reason. So, and I know that's very popular for people to kind of think that way, that they should be separate. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you could please also like the video, I would really appreciate it. And if you could share it on your channels to help get the word out, so more people can see my videos, I would appreciate it. And while you're down below in the comments, please definitely take a moment to, look me up on social media: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky. I have a link to my blog down there where I've shared content before. And it, content like I'm creating stuff that you can just grab and use in a old school style class and level fantasy game system. And a lot of it is just very edition neutral. And then you'll also find a place where you can visit my shop, which again, as I've mentioned, is the best way that you can support my channel right now, to help me upgrade my equipment and just to let me know that you're showing support for the videos that I'm putting. They do take a lot of time. And I do have a day job as well, running my ad agency. I run a boutique ad agency. So I have to find extra time to do these. So buying a little something from my shop, like a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, notebook, is just a nice way to say thanks. And it's also giving you something that you can either gift to a friend or a family member or wear for yourself. So that's going to be it for this particular video. And I would like to say thank you very, very much for watching. Happy gaming. Stay safe, and I will talk to you next time. All right, and now for the bonus content, what I was drinking and what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So I actually took these notes over several days, so I'm just going to kind of do the most recent thing that I was checking out. But drinking, I was having this, so I'm recording this on December 12th, so I'm still kind of in my Christmas beer phase. And this is a PERE NOEL, which is a Christmas ale, an exceptional Xmas beer, as they say here, by BROUWERJI RANKE. And so it's a very untraditional Christmas beer. So usually Christmas beers are a little sweet, a little spicy, very malty. And this one's different. Now, again, I do realize I'm not using the proper glass for this type of beer. But, I like these glasses and I only get to use them once a year. So my wife bought these for me years ago. And so this one, what's interesting about this, it's much more bitter. So I've talked before about how I do like bitter drinks. And so this one also has, it definitely has those spices in there that you can, just the nose, you can totally smell them. But while you are getting the malt and or the yeast, there's like a little bit of a licorice flavor in this almost, or like an anise flavor. Very different. But it's fun. It's not something I would drink every day, but it's very appropriate for the holidays. And then for the record, so I thought about, again, today is December 12th. So I thought about showcasing one of my Frank Sinatra Christmas albums because this is the anniversary of his birth. But I thought you guys are all kind of familiar with the Frank Sinatra. So I just picked something else out that kind of fits within the aesthetic of the channel here, which is Christmas in the Stars, the Star Wars Christmas album. Okay, and so you see this lovely artwork here, and it says featuring the original cast, R2-D2 and Anthony Daniels. Or I'm sorry, yeah, Anthony Daniels as C-3PO. And so it's just very goofy. You can see my copy here was originally loaned for promotional use only. It's got some ringware here, which is, if you ever see that kind of circle on an old vinyl, that's the old vinyl that's rubbed through underneath, and that's called ringware. But in any event, this is a concept album by MECO. So if you grew up in the 70s or in the Star Wars era, you might be familiar with this, Galactic Funk by MECO. So it's kind of like the Star Wars disco album, especially one of the songs on that one. So they did this one too, and it's just goofy. It's not something you're going to listen to all the time, but it's it's exactly what you think it would be. It has nothing to do with the Star Wars holiday special. It's not like any of the Life Day stuff. It's just goofy sort of like twists of Christmas songs, of traditional Christmas songs, but with the Star Wars characters. So anyway, I thought you guys might enjoy that just because it's something you don't see it, come up very often. I was super excited when I saw this I found this at Record Parlor in Hollywood, and I was just so excited to pick this up. So, that's going to be it again. So I do want to say thanks for watching. If you could please check out some of these other videos that you're going to see here, if you haven't seen them yet, or even if maybe watch it again, I would appreciate it. And once again, thanks for watching all the way to the end to this part. I do enjoy putting this little bonus section together, and cheers to you and happy holidays.